Thank you, sir.
You deserve it.
Thank you. Wow. Thank you, Bill. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. When I graduated 20 years ago this year for my doctoral program, I never imagined I'd be here. Thank you for this opportunity. Second, thank you to so many of you whose work will be reflected in my talk tonight. I apologize in advance. I probably am not citing you. I'll cite you in the published version, but I am just in awe of the incredible scholarship that is happening in our field right now. It's richly researched, it's richly theoretical, it's challenging, it's critical, and a lot of it is very honest. So thank you. Okay. My remarks reflect two issues that I've grappled with over the last 20 years of my career. My first has to do with narrativity. Over the years, I've worried that general histories of American education are essentially white histories that universalize white people's experiences and also do not account for whiteness. Some of my work on religion that Bill was so generous about is guilty of this. In the past, I've called it the Chapter 4 problem, which is to say that in these general histories, non-white people appear somewhere in Chapter 4. My second concern comes from my encounters with social science. I was once skeptical of social science thinking. I fancied myself, a historian in a school of education, as an enlightened contrarian. Some years later, however, I had my road to Damascus moment. I met a law professor who used social science theories to understand why people obey laws and what they learn about themselves as citizens from encounters with legal authorities. Over many years of coffee and conversation and through articles appearing in education, law, and social science journals, that law professor and I developed a way of understanding criminal legal systems as educational systems. Social science does have something to offer, it seems to me, that is uniquely relevant to understanding the past as well as the present. Today's talk brings together these two strands of thinking to frame a general theory of educational history that is both inclusive and does not ignore or marginalize the role of white supremacy as a central function of schooling. I hope it is useful. They came from all over the state and other states. It was the first day of school, fall 1957, and a white mob assembled outside Little Rock, Arkansas High School to protest the arrival of 9 black teenagers to the formerly all-white school. Attracting national attention, the state's governor sent the National Guard to, quote, maintain or restore peace and good order by assisting the mob, not the children. We're all familiar with what happened next. President Eisenhower asked the governor to let the children in. Instead, the governor withdrew the state troops. Little Rock police could not adequately control the mob, and Eisenhower sent in federal troops who spent the year guarding the kids. Within a year, states across the South began closing all public schools rather than let black children access white schools in a violent and cynical game of legal hide and seek. We still live in its aftermath. How do we explain what's happening in this moment? A politically progressive view, still popular among historians of education, suggests that images like this are exceptional. The public good has been a core goal of public schooling, and reciprocally, public schooling has been an unalloyed good for the United States. Schooling was imperfect, of course, in this account, and excluded particular groups, but things are getting better. In that sense, the mob is historically exceptional or regionally idiosyncratic. The kids are marching Arkansas into a better future to the tune of the 14th Amendment. A second, less common but highly influential accounting of schooling frames it in economic terms. Schools allocate public and private goods, generate society-wide human capital, and individual social mobility. The economic framing of schooling also marginalizes minoritized people, however, and sidelines racism. It might partially explain why the children and their parents are putting themselves in harm's way, although we know they had other motivations too. But I don't think the economic framing accounts for the mob, who are not there for their own individual private interests, nor are they there to support the economic development of Arkansas. A third accounting, rooted in Black American, Latinx, Native, and other subaltern histories, as well as critical race theories, decenters white people as the modal protagonists of educational experience. This family of scholarship frames schools as institutions promoting white racial interests against which non-whites resist strategically and contingently. Little Rock is unexceptional in this accounting, even if its details might play out uniquely. This view is incompatible with the first two, and to my mind is actually more persuasive. But it still leaves me wondering about the good. How can so many people believe that schooling is a good when it seems to do so much harm? If Little Rock is unexceptional, how can we explain the goals and functions of schooling in the United States in a way that accounts for the mob, the kids, the various legal authorities, and the violence? In this talk, I offer a new way of framing the goals and functions of schooling in the United States. Schooling has never been a public good, not in its goals nor in its function. Instead, I will argue that schooling is a white good. The struggle for racial justice has been the struggle of moving schooling from a white good to a public good. Calling schooling a white good is, I hope, a small and logical step from the remarkable work that many historians, legal scholars, social scientists, and others have done in the last 30 years, excavating and explaining the way in which schooling in the United States is a fundamentally racial project. It also accounts for and corrects racially naive political and economic framings. I hope it's useful. My paper has 5 parts. Part 1 will describe the problems with calling schooling a public good. Part 2 offers white goods as an alternative framework. Part 3 will look at some of the primary mechanisms by which schooling has secured white advantage over time, and how people who cannot claim whiteness have resisted these and insisted on schooling being a public good. Part 4 examines the role of violence in protecting schooling as a white good. I will then conclude with some remarks on what the white goods framework might get us. Scholars talk about schooling and the public good in 2 ways. The first is to engage the idea of the public good. It is a conversation as old as philosophy. The second is the idea of a public good in an economic sense, and is of recent vintage. Both are problematic for describing the history of schooling in the United States. The anachronism of the public good is straightforward enough. The word public comes directly from the Latin publicus, meaning in relation to the people at large, generally applicable and related to government. By the early colonial period, it was used in a similar fashion. Importantly, however, both then and now, the word is available to both anti-democratic and liberal democratic versions of society. Whether in the slave republic of Rome or the slave colony of Virginia, the public meant both the existing social arrangement and all the people in it. In my slide, I show the seal of the colony of New York, an image that depicts the legitimacy of the colonial legal project as literally depending on the domination of racialized others. British colonial governments throughout the Atlantic explicitly and implicitly framed Native and Black people as civic outsiders, objects of the law, but not participants in its processes or its protections. The enslavement and or subordination of some groups of people were the goals of government for the promotion of the public good. After the Revolution, when white Americans began systematically organizing state services like safety, education, health, and legal due process, one of the biggest questions in American politics was whether and how to use government to create a society that accorded people different levels of status. Who enjoyed the protection of the law? Who could vote? Who could own property or be somebody else's? Who could participate in schooling? A look at state constitutions reveals that when most authorities in the antebellum said the public good, they referred to social stability and progress, but not to the radical notion that all people should enjoy legal privileges, including formal education. It can be misleading today when historians identify points in the past when writers intoned words like the common good or the public good, or described common schools as being open to all, as a way of arguing that schooling was for the good of all people in society. It wasn't. In economics, it was Samuelson's 1954 article, The Pure Theory of Public Expenditure, that launched the modern career of a public good. A public good, he argued, is something that is useful to anyone that can consume it. It's non-exclusive, and such consumption does not limit other people's consumption or benefit. It's non-rivalrous. Private goods are the polar opposite of public goods according to the original definition. Their consumption is exclusive and individualistic. The argument was scandalously naive. I assume no mystical collective mind that enjoys collective consumption goods, he wrote. Instead, I assume each individual has an ordinal set of preferences with respect to his consumption of all goods, collective as well as private. Of course, whiteness was at the time, and still is, just such a collective mind, influenced by the collective utility of white goods to any white person. Non-white people's resistance to whiteness and the collective identities they formed were also neither public nor private. The racial naivete of economic theory was recognized even at the time. Du Bois, of course, had identified the wages of whiteness in black Reconstruction, and respected economist Gunnar Myrdal criticized his field in his blockbuster study An American Dilemma, arguing that the good is a moral problem and not one of mere valuation along hedonistic or utilitarian lines. Racism, he agreed with Du Bois, was foundational to American society. Undaunted, however, Samuelson and his peers continued to ignore or sideline race in their pursuit of ideal theories of human activity. Economists developed race-blind theories of educational mobility, of residential choice, and of government investment in human capital that ignored the obvious structured white advantage that existed in each of these. During the 1970s, racially naive economic frameworks developed in the 50s and 60s entered the mainstream of public policy. They entered the mainstream of educational policy, specifically in the 1980s. In the face of calls for the privatization of schools, some historians sought to emphasize the public good traditions of schooling, that the public good was an enduring goal of schooling, that public goods in an economic sense were endemic to the function of schooling. In terms of the debate, however, they were using the master's tools to try to take down the master's house. Schooling in the United States was never for, as a goal, and never was, as a practice, a public good. It was for white people, and it was a white good. Critical race theory emerged in the 1980s as well from the field of law, and by the 1990s, scholars produced a variety of sophisticated critical theories of how race functions in American public policy, including education. Some of these are central to my foundational theory of schooling as a white good. So the first and most obvious is Cheryl Harris, who argued that whiteness is a form of property, a type of legalized, exclusive access to legal protections, processes, and privileges. George Lipschitz and Edward Bonilla Silva, among others, have argued that racism is structural, not idiosyncratic, and not individual. Charles Tilley developed a theory of opportunity hoarding to understand how white people leverage their networks to acquire exclusive access to seemingly open resources. Work expanded in educational history by John Rury and in educational sociology by John Diamond and Amanda Lewis. Victor Ray has built on structural race theories to develop a theory of racialized organizations, arguing that race is central to the history, structure, and functioning of American organizations, including schools. Finally, the most influential work to a theory of white goods comes from critical race scholars in law and economics, including Robert Kuder and Daria Roithmeier, who look at whiteness as a cartel. Roithmeier argues that the history of public policy across the 20th century, including the history of schooling in particular, was shaped by white cartel behavior to such a degree that white advantage may now be, quote, locked in by self-perpetuating structures and institutions, even if on paper, white cartel behavior is now illegal. Okay, my theory of schooling as a white good requires brief definitions of both white and good. Whiteness was, until quite recently, a formal legal category in American law and a foundational one in custom, from the local to the state and federal. It described a group of people who enjoyed special group rights, privileges, and goods in relation to other non-white people. Even today, surface changes in the law have not changed the salience of whiteness in implicit and explicit behavior, belief, and cultural practices, nor has the law corrected the many social structures erected or tolerated by previous laws that continue to harm non-white people and provide privilege to white people. Whiteness in its details, of course, can be an unstable category because white people do not exist in any physical sense, and historians have shown that precise legal applications of whiteness and related racial hierarchies have shifted depending on time and place, although these definitions have been anchored in anti-nativeness and anti-blackness. Outside of formal laws, white goods have been advanced through other means, from private organizations and agreements, popular culture, school curricula, and economic behavior, to outright defiance by legal authorities against those of other jurisdictions, like we saw in Little Rock. Gaining access to white goods in one particular sphere of law, say when Mexican or Chinese children were classified as white by state law, has never been a guarantee of access to whiteness in other legal jurisdictions, in daily practice, or in the face of white violence. Because whiteness is a category of social dominance and privilege, and not just a kind of difference, a white good would be something that is useful to white people as the dominant racialized group in relation to other subordinated racialized groups. White goods are, by definition, non-white harms. That white goods are designed to benefit white people does not mean, of course, that they cannot be useful to non-whites. Obviously they can. But because a white good must advantage white people more than other people by definition to keep them white, a white good will be less useful to non-whites than to whites. White goods are relative, in other words, as well as absolute. In fact, when non-white people participate in a white good, their very participation reinforces the underlying system that favors white people. Likewise, identifying the existence of white goods does not mean that denying poverty and oppression against people who are white, or that white goods benefit every single white person in every instance. White goods are categorical, just like race is. They exist in the aggregate. They offer unfair advantages in an already unfair system that allocates many harms to many people: women, differently abled, gender nonconforming, and the like. Finally, as I will explore later, white goods depend on violence. Schooling in the United States is a nearly ideal example of a white good. Historically, the maintenance of white advantage has been a primary political goal of schooling, and until the 1970s, it was an overt one. This was not accidental. Common schools and later public schools were not developed for a public that happened to be white. White Americans organized and regulated formal learning for their advantage as a white people against the interests of non-white people during a time when the United States was a diverse society that allocated different civic statuses to different people depending on the myth of race. Today, schooling is a social practice that launders white social advantage, both inherited and updated, in the name of merit. Yes, schooling can be beneficial for everyone. And yes, many non-whites can succeed brilliantly, obviously, while many non-whites can fail. And also, non-white people have generated their own goods as acts of self-determination and resistance within the schools designed for the good of people who are white. But resistance adds cost and risk. And not having to resist is an advantage conferred on children who identify and were allowed to identify as white. When African American parents tell their children they will have to work twice as hard for half as much, they are espousing an economic theory of schooling as a white good. That schooling is critically important for their children's future and lives, and also that it is something that is designed for their disadvantage. Okay, let's look at mechanisms. Beginning with the regulation of black learning in the slaveholding South and the formation of common schooling in the North, white Americans have used formal education as a key mechanism for racial reproduction. White Americans have used nearly every aspect of schooling to reproduce the existence of their group and its advantages, to give meaning and value to white-occupied spaces, to support group identity formation, to create and valorize white history, language, and culture, to allocate cultural capital, create jobs, promote religion, develop individual and collective human capital, provide corporate welfare, childcare, social certification, and more. Non-whites have succeeded in using many of these aspects of schooling too, but at greater cost, and with greater precarity, and at greater risk. In this section, I briefly sketched three of the prime mechanisms of schooling as a white good: the land and how schools are placed, what schools teach, and how schools control opportunity, which I refer to as hobbling. The first factor is land. From the early 17th century to the early 20th, Europeans conquered, commodified, and developed a vast swath of the earth, some 3 million square miles in what became the lower 48 states. Control of places became a key mechanism that white Americans have used to maintain their advantage over people they raced as others. After the Revolution of 1776, state and federal governments sold former native homelands, which they called the public domain, to encourage the development of schooling. In higher education, for example, some 11 million acres of native homelands were commodified by the Morrill Act of 1862 to support state colleges and universities. The commodification of native homelands to support common schooling overshadows the higher ed land grants by an order of magnitude. Between 1795 and 1912, state and federal governments granted 129 million acres of land for common schools, an area nearly the size of France. By the end of the 19th century, most states west of the Mississippi received more than 10% of their school budgets from federal, or in the case of Texas, state land grants. Historians once questioned the efficiency of this process. But the important point here is that they did it and created incalculable harm to the indigenous people for the benefit of schooling as a white good. Once settled, white people organized society spatially in ways that contained and constrained non-whites. Schooling has been central to that process, as many scholars in our field have shown. The political economy of places varied by region, but the centrality of white advantage was a core principle of educational development across all regions. In the pre-Civil War South, formal education was highly exclusive to white people, regulated, closely monitored, and enforced through extreme physical and psychological violence. Nevertheless, when white interest was served by non-white schooling, it was allowed, as Frederick Douglass experienced here in the city of Baltimore. In Connecticut and New Hampshire, white people famously used mob violence and legal procedure in tandem to block black students from attending schools, arguing that such institutions would encourage black in-migration to the region and affect real estate values. In the Midwest, and increasingly the West, white governments restricted black settlement and often excluded those black people who did settle from using common schools through explicit laws or mob violence. White delegates of the future state of Illinois avoided putting a provision for common schooling in their state constitution for fear that it would attract black people to the state. The common schools in Oregon were legally white-only schools since starting in 1844, the territorial government enacted a series of laws attempting to expel all black people from the state. Oregonians later wrote black exclusion into their original state constitution, which the U.S. Congress approved the very same year, 1857, that the Supreme Court ruled that no black person could be a citizen of the United States. In what Kate Mazur calls the first civil rights movement, Native and black people, together with some whites, fought back. Before emancipation, some enslaved people managed to steal a formal education. They resisted and organized in the quotidian interactions of daily life to raise their children. Free black people in the North strategically resisted overt exclusion from schooling by asserting their rights at the local level, by giving speeches, writing, holding conventions, lobbying, and litigating. They gave us the Reconstruction Amendments, pushing existing systems in the North to accept non-white children and building new state-supported school systems in the South. During and after Reconstruction, however, white people adapted to these changes. They reorganized the spatial containment of black people and Native Americans and applied it to new groups, most notably Mexicans and East Asians, with the express purpose of protecting exclusive white access to goods like safety, transportation, housing, healthcare, and schooling. In the South, state and local governments protected white goods through Jim Crow and, when able, adopted northern methods of spatial organization. To accomplish all of this, white-controlled federal, state, and local governments rolled back, reinterpreted, or simply ignored Reconstruction-era laws. In its Plessy decision in 1896, the Supreme Court gave legal cover to segregation as a strategy of white supremacy. The infamous red line maps, like the one here of Baltimore in my slide, came late in the game. The racial ordering of space allowed white people to create deeply unequal systems of school funding based on local real estate value and other indicators of whiteness. This forced non-whites to pay more for schooling while enabling whites, especially as they gained wealth, to pay less for more schooling. Race-based inequalities in taxation were compounded by white political control of school boards. The 20th century, non-white resistance to all of this is fairly well known. Their greatest victories were in law. For time's sake, I will not review that important history here. But, as the first wave of critical race theorists observed, the neutering of overt racial discrimination was clearly insignificant. And once again, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of white goods, determining in several key cases in the 1970s that legal categories historically designed to protect white dominance, segregated school districts, property tax laws, did not violate the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection. The court has been slowly dismantling racial anti-discrimination law ever since. These structures of white advantage continue to operate within the school choice models we have today. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5, 6, or 7, said Baldwin, to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to see Gary Cooper killing off Indians, and although you are rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians are you. For 200 years, mass schooling in the United States has provided a formal education rooted in colonial knowledge. School curricula have defined civic insiders and outsiders, framed right and wrong perspectives, promoted facts from geography and science, all with white settler identity at the core. Historical studies of textbooks have found white superiority, non-white inferiority, and the erasure of critical voices and histories to be constant themes from the early 19th century to the late 20th. During certain historical moments of strong political pressure for racial justice, white-authored curriculum softened, and non-white authors crafted formal curricula, most notably Black History Week, which became Black History Month. Likewise, teachers of color engaged in their work in a variety of ways that sometimes included active and passive resistance to white supremacy, ethics of care and community uplift, and political activism outside the schoolhouse. The very existence of Black History Month is evidence of the centering of whiteness as everyday, normalized experience, as well as the ongoing struggle against it. Higher learning gave whiteness its pedigree. Leon Litwack famously chastised the field of history for, quote, the miseducation of Negro youth with regard to race. The miseducation of American youth with regard to race, thinking Carter Woodson there. Charles Mills has offered similarly withering critique of the field of philosophy. Critical race theorists have exploded the field of law and legal studies. And in his 40 books and over 700 articles, John Dewey never once confronted directly the problem of white supremacy for classroom teaching and learning or for knowledge production. His philosophy was the ideal vehicle for schooling as a white good, gaslighting the obvious, indeed central, project of white supremacy in education. Colleges and universities have historically existed to promote the white good to their bones. Even higher ed institutions designed for the benefit of non-white students, such as HBCUs, have struggled to contend with culture, knowledge, oversight, philanthropy, student loans, regulation, law, and a prior K-12 education system that all provide white advantage and non-white harm. Much of what is recognizably non-white about knowledge production today, teaching and learning in American higher education, is the result of the activism, personal cost, and risk of students, families, faculty, and communities of color. A third critically important mechanism of schooling as a white good is what I have called hobbling. Economists, sociologists, and historians of education hold up schooling as the single most important factor in social mobility. Indeed, one economist recently penned a guest essay for the New York Times, you might have read it, declaring that schooling is for mobility, touting more schooling as the obvious solution for black poverty. This racially naive view of what schooling has done to black and brown people over the last 2 centuries is pretty standard fare for the field of economics. When we recognize the history of schooling as a white good, however, schooling in the United States appears to be less about mobility for everyone who participates and more about systematically hobbling non-white children. I use the word hobbling advisedly. For millennia, humans have used hobbling as a form of social mobility reduction to the point of domination. In the context of the racial enslavement system of 19th century America, enslavers used physical and psychological disfigurement as well as mechanical devices to prevent the mobility of enslaved people out of their enslavement. As white Americans developed and then expanded their schooling practices, they used schooling as a means to hobble black, Latinx, and other non-white children as members of society, both in terms of limiting their access to academic development and credentials acquisition, but also in terms of their access to skills development. Schooling as a white good has been a key contributor to black and brown poverty and one of the primary engines of non-white disadvantage. Educational hobbling is an aggregative process, not an individual one. The expansion of school attainment for non-white children over the long 20th century, by some measures, is not the point. The point is that relative school attainment on the aggregate has remained quite unequal. As a white good, schooling on the whole makes it harder and riskier for children of color to compete with white children in the zero-sum game of schooling. You might even say twice as hard for half as much. Well, sorry. Economic theories of human capital development are equally naive. For example, historians of education have recently made the case that the 20th century was, for the United States, the human capital century. This claim follows a long tradition of classical economic theory, arguing that states have incentives to train their workforce and reap the benefits when they do. The main evidence human capital historians cite with regard to race is the slow narrowing of enrollment rates over the course of the century. What they do not consider is the long history of wide and deliberately constructed differences in quality of education available to children of color within schools. Not just the curriculum that does conceptual violence, but career tracking and the disparate opportunities for post-secondary education rooted in household wealth, the availability of extracurricular opportunities, and the risk of criminal justice contact, the interlocking design of school locations and residential segregation, and the centuries-long investment in de-skilling brown and black children in terms of the workforce and political capital. Of course, schooling has only been partially successful in hobbling children of color, of course. Racialized children and families in racialized schools face relative aggregate advantages, but there are many examples of excellent schools, excellent teachers, and successful, thriving children. Historians of education, some in this room, are increasingly recovering these stories of resistance, efficacy, and excellence. Moreover, when schools fail them, people of color have historically created their own groups and organizations, their own funds of knowledge, their own joys and markers of a civic belonging and a good life. Religious bodies, civic organizations, fraternities and sororities, family networks, community groups, all help provide capital when schools do not. People of color have leveraged the mainstream political system, too, to achieve educational change. Okay. So far, my argument begs the question, how did white Americans maintain all these advantages when there's constant resistance? The very short answer is that schooling as a white good was built with violence, has been maintained by violence, and it does violence. While patterns and mechanisms of violence have changed, there is a traceable through line from colonial-era settlement and enslavement to 21st century school-to-prison pipelines and backflows. It is extremely difficult to take a theory of schooling as a public good seriously when we see just how far white Americans have been willing to go to keep from sharing it. I'll set aside all the violence before the late 19th century. From the collapse of Reconstruction to the mid-20th century, white people on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line have continued to use extreme forms of violence and terrorism to defend white goods, especially schools, with impunity and even the assistance of legal authorities. Bryan Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative estimates that between 1865 and 1950, Americans committed some 6,500 lynchings, some against deviant whites, but most against non-whites, Chinese, Mexican, Native, and especially Black Americans, as forms of overt racial terrorism. In coordination with this violence, property law and police agencies reinforced the boundaries. White mobs committed massacres against entire non-white communities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries: Wounded Knee, Springfield and East St. Louis, Illinois, Tulsa, Oklahoma, to name just a few. Between 1917 and 1921, black homes in Chicago were bombed on average once every 20 days. The violence has changed since the aggressive role of the federal government after the 1960s. At the same time, however, the last half-century has added a whole new arsenal against our non-white children. Zero-tolerance punishment regimes in schools and the coordinated massification of criminal justice outside of them. The scale and racial disproportionality of criminal justice processing for the last 40 years are historically unprecedented and difficult to exaggerate. What you have here over time is total number of people who are incarcerated. You can see that before about 1980, historical rates would, if you look at rates, not pure numbers, historically rates were pretty consistent throughout the 20th century and across what we might consider peer nations. But then in the United States uniquely, they took off in the 1980s to rates we just haven't seen ever anywhere. Between 1970 and 2010, the rate exploded to over 750 people per 100,000, well over 2 million people incarcerated. The disparate impact on non-whites has been severe. Among American men born in 2001, around the age of my two sons, 1 in 17 white men, 1 in 6 Latinx men, and 1 in 3 black men will spend some time imprisoned. I don't have the numbers for Native men, but they're not good either. So-called proactive policing has had similar disproportionate racial effects. In a single year, for example, NYPD stopped and patted down 80% of African American adolescents aged 16 to 17, as opposed to rates of 38% for Latinx and 10% for white. School attendance of black boys dropped during periods when NYPD was saturating their neighborhoods, a drop not seen for other children. Schools mirrored criminal justice. Zero-tolerance punishment regimes upped the consequences for alleged bad behavior in school. School safety reforms expanded the presence of sworn police officers in schools, especially schools serving non-white children. Not surprisingly, black and brown children have been punished more often and more severely than white children for similar offenses. In 2003, scholars started referring to this phenomenon as the school-to-prison pipeline. The massification of criminal justice in and outside of schools has created a whole new system of state violence that disproportionately harms brown and especially black children of color, making it harder to do well in school and riskier to make mistakes there than it is for white children. Okay. So what does this way of seeing get us? First, I ended the body of my argument on the theme of violence because I think it's critically important to recognize that that little white schoolhouse, that so-called laboratory of democracy on the endless western frontier, rested on non-white harms, the worst harms. It's problematic in our work as historians to view schooling as a white good with romantic nostalgia unless we are recovering stories of resistance, empowerment, and justice. Whose history are we writing? Second, turning schooling from a white good into something resembling a public good calls all of us to the work of writing racism back into the many subfields of history of education. I think it's fair to say that there is enough access to primary evidence and secondary scholarship now that there is no area of educational history in the United States where we can shrug off the role of race as unknowable, as I once did. Whiteness has colored all the parts of schooling: teaching and learning, curriculum, place, sex and gender, policy, religion, punishment, pop culture, early childhood and higher education, international and global expansion, even the methods we use in the archives we inhabit. Third, and finally, I think historians can play a critical role in moving schooling from a white good to a public one. Understanding the specific mechanisms of schooling as a white good and the way people have resisted point pathways toward making it a public good. I think this requires both and thinking. By that I mean that formal education is critical to human flourishing and the health of a just and democratic society. Schooling as a technology of education has historically delivered a great many goods. And also, that same schooling has and does deliver a great many harms. Not only absolute harms, but relative harms. Our work as historians of education entails explaining how schooling as a social practice has historically done both. Thank you.